Okay. Um, the next section here we're going to do is titled Indian Nationalism. And let's recall, if we can, for a second, what nationalism means in the first place, right? And nationalism is something that was growing big in early 1800s Europe. It's this intense national pride, patriotism times two. It's not just like, hey, I'm proud of my country. I'm proud to be, an American or, a Californian. It's more like, I am proud to be an American, and I think that we should only care about America. And I think we should only do what's right for America and not do what's right for other people's. And if you don't like it, or if you're not American, you're my enemy, right? It's really intense. It's a step past like national pride, and it enters into this kind of all for your country, only for your country, no one else, nothing else matters type of attitude. And there's varying degrees, slight nationalism, um, put America first, right? Intense nationalism. If you're not American, you're my enemy. So I'm not going to try and decide exactly where India was or England was at this point. But in India, we're going to start to see a nationalist movement. There are going to be people, again, same old story, right? Educated in British schools, in British universities, in the cities of India. One thing to keep in mind is that this movement, this kind of education movement, the advances that the British brought to India and to other Southeast Asian and African countries, it was really evident in the cities, where when you got outside of the cities and you got into the areas of very poor people who lived kind of off the land, they very rarely felt the positive impacts of British influence. They were um, oftentimes just made poorer by the British. The British would take their land for the farms. So if anyone benefited from European colonial rule in this period, anywhere in the areas we've talked about this last bit, it's going to happen in the cities. And the people who suffer the most will be people who kind of live in the more rural areas in the countryside. This does start in the cities, the big cities of India. And there were some people who at first, these highly educated people, sometimes lawyers, educated in British law, and they said, let's work within the system. Let's use the law to try and make changes necessary. And they oftentimes would quickly find out that the law doesn't apply to them, that the same British laws that they studied in the law books only apply to British people in India. They didn't apply to Indians in India, specifically if the Indian's grievance was against a British person, right? So maybe if I'm an Indian man and this Indian man over here wronged me, I can use British law to punish, or to get something from the Indian man who had wronged me. But if this was a British man who had wronged me, especially a rich British man, forget about it, right? Law is not going to work for me. And eventually we see some ideas, some people saying we should maybe try and use a violent rebellion, especially after the Sepoy Mutiny. But one of the problems with this was that India was not a united country. So every time there was a movement to try and rebel against the British, the Hindus of more India proper would maybe start gathering steam, but the Muslims, kind of on the outskirts parts of India, would not support those movements in fear that the Hindus would get too powerful, and then after they defeated the British, they would crush the Muslims. The Hindu were the majority population of India at this point. In 1885, the INC, or the Indian National Congress, was formed, and they asked for a share in governing responsibilities, a share of the role of governing India. And they were not able to get this as well. Again, repeating problems, right? the Muslim population didn't want to be part of this new Indian National Congress. They wanted a separate Indian National Conference for Muslims. And we're going to find out that disunity oftentimes equals weakness, um, which is a really strong argument for unity in our own country in a time when it seems often like we are so disunited. But I digress. In 1915, right before World War I, a young British educated man named Gandhi comes home to India, and he's going to begin a non-violent revolution. Here's a picture of young Gandhi. We don't see Gandhi young often. Gandhi went to school in Britain, and after he graduated from law school in Britain, he went to South Africa, the British colony of South Africa, where he found out that not only are white Englishmen above African South Africans, but that people from India who had moved to South Africa because Britain owned both, so if you're in India, you can move to South Africa, were also treated lower level than the English. And he learned his nonviolent protest movement from South Africa. So to kind of complete that full circle, right, we know that Dr. Martin Luther King is going to take many of his ideas of nonviolent protest from Gandhi. Gandhi got a lot of those ideas from Africa in his time as a lawyer there. I think he was a lawyer there for almost 20 years. And he brought those ideas back to India, where he would use them to eventually get the British to leave. Yeah, the sword is not going to be the instrument of finally getting the British to leave India. Instead, it's going to be the nonviolent protest and really the imagery of British. It's shaming the British. The imagery of the treatment of nonviolent protesters by the British is going to shame the British to eventually leaving. Similarly, we may argue to the images of Americans and their poor treatment of Black civil rights leaders during the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement will lead to the US government being shamed into passing civil rights legislation, right? What we're going to find, we will next year, that after the events at Selma, after horrific events in our country's history, we then oftentimes found that significant legislation was passed that made a step in the direction of equality. So again, nonviolent protest is successful in a large part. People have to suffer and sacrifice of themselves. I think John Lewis, but when that abuse is made public, the more powerful country is sometimes then shamed into making the changes that probably should have happened without them having to commit atrocities against the nonviolent, less powerful person. I mean, just think about it for a second, if you will. If, say, the big football player, right, Taft. I don't know who the biggest football player is at Taft. I'm 6'5", and 215 pounds. 220. I shouldn't. And if I, as a strong guy, big strong guy, was seen hitting a weak, small, defenseless, not fighting with me person, that'd be something that people would shame at me for. Like, what the heck's wrong with you, dude? Why'd you hit that person who was defenseless and their hands were down and they're not even half your size? You got issues, right? And then maybe I would say, oh man, that was my bad, right? I was not cool of me, I apologize. I'll make some changes and, go to counseling. I don't know what as an individual would be appropriate to do for that type of behavior, but it's I don't know if that's a fair analogy, But that is one way that we found nonviolent protests working, is by shaming the more powerful group who was then being abusive to the nonviolent protesters. And we're going to find out that that's one thing Gandhi does in this period.